Welcome to a new episode of the Astra podcast. Today is a very special episode for me because we'll be talking about Elena's book, which came out after she passed away. And I invited three scholars, which I know personally, and I consider friends, and who knew Elena quite well. So we are gathered here to discuss a little bit about her book and, of course, about her work. I introduce you Henrique Leitão from the University of Lisbon, who is until very recently head of the Department of the History of Science, History and Philosophy of Sciences, and is also the head of an ERC project called the Router Project. Charles Burnett, who was Elena's supervisor in her PhD studies, and of course, everyone knows, works at the Warburg Institute, and Dorian Greenbaum, who has researched a lot on the history of astrology, especially in the Hellenistic traditions, and who also knew Elena very well. And thank you all to be here. I hope I have done a proper introduction. So let's start a little bit by talking about the book. So the book was edited by Belle in the Time and Calendars collection quite recently, last June, and it has the last of Elena's great work, which was her PhD. Her thesis is here, and her research is gathered here. And the book is quite a large volume with 400, a little bit over 400 pages, which is entitled An Astrologer at Work in Late Medieval France, the Notebooks of S. Belle. And it's a study on the astrological practices of this figure, S. Belle, who it is assumed that his first name is Simon Belle. We are not exactly sure about that, but it's a high possibility. And it falls within Elena's aim of research, and also the aim of research that the Astra project was created for, which is the study of the history of astrological techniques and practices. So, which one of you wants to?
I think I will, start in for about, 4 or 5 minutes, and then I will pass the word to Charles. I would like, as some sort of preliminary considerations, I would like to tell a little bit about how I met Elena, and this my meeting with Elena coincided with her entry into the field of history of science, and this is why I'm talking about this here. So I don't remember the exact date. This was, 10, 15 years ago, don't remember. I was giving a lecture in Lisbon, some public place, maybe the National Library, I don't remember. But I do remember that when I finished the lecture, it was about some astronomical topic, history of astronomy. Then this young lady, very elegant young lady, and with a very smiley face, full of joy, approached me, and she just started, talking to me about some topic related to the lecture. And this, as we all know, it happens quite often after you give a lecture. So people approach and start talking. But what I immediately realized was that she had an uncommon knowledge of many astrological topics, because, soon the conversation diverted to astrological issues related to my lecture. And so it took me, for, 3 or 4 minutes to realize that not only she was a very pleasant person that was for the first time talking to me, but she was a very learned person in astronomy and especially in astrology. And so I think two things happened. Well, first we became immediate friends. I mean, the conversation lasted for half an hour more or something, and then we exchanged contacts. But I immediately realized that I had there a very important ally, because I was at that moment trying to set up a solid tradition in history of science in Lisbon, at the University of Lisbon. So I had set up a doctoral program, and the embryo of a department was being created, etc. So I was very much in need of allies to do this. From there I continued meeting Elena, and for many days it was always a revelation for me. And then other things that I've come to understand or realize about her character along the days was not only she was a very joyful person and a very pleasant person, as I said, also very elegant, but she had enormous ambitions. She always had immense plans for things, and huge conferences, and changing the world of scholarly research on so many topics. So it was lots of fun in this, because it was always very ambitious, her plans are. But also she had a very, very determination. She had an iron will. When she wanted something, she really wanted, and she would go for it. So the whole mix of her personality traits were very, very, very interesting. So we did become very, very good friends. Not only very good friends, but she was for me a very trusted colleague. Now, at that time, she wanted to pursue. She had made already a master's degree. She had obtained a master's degree already related in a topic of astrology, but she wanted to pursue studies in the history of astrology at a higher level, at a more deep level. And she had, I don't know if discovered, but bumped into a manuscript in Lisbon, and she was fascinated with a certain manuscript. And we talked a little bit about this. So, what I immediately realized is that she had all the potential, although it was a little bit risky because her academic path had been a little bit uncommon, but still I thought that she had all the potential to go to a top place and to work with the most knowledgeable person in the field that I knew. And by pure chance, I had met Charles Burnett some years before, and of course I knew parts of his work, not all, but parts of his work. And it was very clear for me. I think I had been at the Warburg once or twice for conferences. It was very clear for me that the Warburg was the right place for her. So I helped her in trying to enter the Warburg as a doctoral candidate. And it was not completely easy because of her path, and also because we had to find the money, the financing, and it was obvious that the financing had to come from Portugal. But this was never a problem for Elena, because she had such determination and such faith and hope in that things would turn out okay. That even this process, which was a little bit, one could be a little bit worried, she was never worried. Oh, this will turn out okay. It will turn out okay. And then this is for me one of the major contributions I did in history of science was to make her meet Charles Burnett. But this is the second part of the story. And then at the end I will have to say a couple of things more when she returned to Lisbon after a doctorate, and the overall impact of her work and her example in the scholarly community of historians of science in Portugal. But I will pass the word now to Charles.
Well, if we're starting off with first recollections, I must say that was in my office at the Warburg Institute when I was confronted with this most beautiful lady. I soon discovered that she was not just outwardly beautiful, but she was beautiful inside as well. I was impressed that she'd already written an MA in Lisbon, indeed, with an Italian title, with a Latin title, Via Sapiens Dominabitur Astris, which I think is a motto that we can all follow, and certainly that she obviously has been following. The wise man will dominate, will have power over the stars. And so on the basis of this very fine MA thesis on astrology in the Portuguese court, she embarked on this thesis at the Warburg Institute on, based on two manuscripts written by the same person, whom we know was S, maybe Simon Belle, in the late 15th century, which she calls rightly notebooks, because he was adding mainly horoscopes, but also astronomical tables to these books, excerpts from astrological textbooks written already in Arabic from the 8th century onwards, but translated into Latin, and a lot of his personal notes in the margins and so on. They were very much working books of a practicing astrologer. And it was right that she should be studying this at the Warburg Institute, because we have a very fine tradition in the study of astrology, taking astrology and astronomy really as a single science, which you could call the science of the stars. But one indication of this is that one of the founders of the Warburg Institute, Fritz Zaxel, inaugurated a catalogue of all illustrated Western astrological manuscripts, which is really a very fine basis for the study of astrology. But of course there are other things like the study of Beatrix, the great magical astral magical textbook of the Middle Ages in Arabic and in Latin. And so the first thing that she did not have to do was to defend astrology and say this is a worthwhile subject, because she was in an atmosphere amongst a community in which it was realized that astrology had a very important place within medieval Renaissance, even more modern society in the West and in the East. And that what was necessary was not so much to trace the history of astrology in terms of the arguments for and against, or in terms of astrologers working for kings and princes, but rather what was necessary was to work out in detail what the astrologer did, what he knew, what information he thought was important for the practice of his art. Just as a doctor has to have his medical textbooks and has to report also on his medical cases. And so what Belle had done was to draw up not only horoscopes of the past, which were kind of models for him, but also horoscopes of his family, of his friends, of various nobles, especially in Burgundy, towards the end of the 15th century. And Helena had obviously a very great sympathy with him. She, of course, had been casting horoscopes herself. She knew astrology, as it were, from the inside. And so it was not, I can say, it was not a difficult task for her to interpret what Belle had been writing in his manuscripts. And, of course, she had Latin, everything was, well, there was some French, but most of the text was in Latin. That needed interpretation, but the fact that she knew what it was likely that Belle, were the conclusions that he was likely to come to, made it much easier for her to understand the Latin text. And she worked methodically and over 3 years, transcribing, translating, and then, of course, commenting. And one advantage of working on this was that the books covered the whole, one could say the whole of astrology, all its genre, and so she was able to structure the book according to astrological genres, which were interrogations, revolutions of the years of the world, conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, and nativities probably the most important, casting the horoscope for a child, for a baby born, And then beyond that, we have the almanacs. But she, of course, also went beyond simply transcribing and interpreting what was said in these manuscripts. She also gave a very sensitive interpretation of the place of astrology, not only in Belle's own thought, but in the thought of his time. So, when you read this book, you're reading, well, the ipsissima verba, of course, of Belle in translation, but also in facsimile, so you can go back to the Latin if you like. But you get such a feeling of the atmosphere of astrological thought, of the practice of astrology, of friends doing astrology, interpreting their lives for each other, as it were. So there's a lot of psychology here. There's a lot of... Astrology is a very intimate subject. It's a way of getting to know people and getting to understand people and helping them in times of trouble or in planning the future and whatever. So it's a very personal kind of subject, and this personality, this personal aspect comes over very strongly in Eleanor's book as well. So it was sad to see her go back to Portugal after spending some time in London, but we kept in touch well until almost the day of her death, and I was really very impressed by the plans that she had for continuing her work, and I just hope that the work that she inaugurated and she planned can be continued by others.
Thank you, Charles.
Yes. Well, thank you, Henrique and Charles, for those lovely introductions. Lots of things popped into my brain as you both were talking, and I guess I will continue the model of just explaining how I came to know Elena, which of course was at the Warburg, because I happened to precede her as a practicing astrologer who was admitted into a PhD program at the Warburg, and she kept telling me, you were the pioneer, but in fact, I mean, I guess chronologically that's true, but I think what she brought to the Warburg was just as important as me chronologically being first. And I will just say that I didn't ever think I would see classes in learning astrology being given at the Warburg, and she pulled that off with great aplomb and great knowledge and skill, and I think when you're coming into a tradition where academically you could do the study, you're doing the study of astrology, and you have many books, manuscripts and printed books available to you at the Warburg. It was very nice to see all of that being taken into consideration, when she arrived to work on this manuscript of S. Belle, first in a Portuguese library, one in a Portuguese library, and then the other one in Paris, which she discovered pretty early on, I think. So I met her when she first came to the Warburg, and like both of you, Henrique and Charles, I was totally struck by her joie de vivre, and we became great friends almost immediately, not only because of our shared interests, but just because she was a really outgoing and cheerful and welcoming person. And she'd come to dinner at my flat, and then she would insist on washing all my dishes after supper. you don't need to do that, I would say to her. No, we have to clean up. And her whole life was really like that. And I think even in her academic life, you can see, as Charles also alluded to in her book, you can see her personality in the book through how she is explaining the notebooks of this astrologer who lived in the 15th century, but who was really carrying on the tradition of astrologers through history. And I was struck in the book, which I've looked at a lot more closely in the past few days. I knew, of course, the general topic of her research, but I was struck by how much it is in the tradition of the writing of astrological notebooks, which we see in a number of other astrologers. I mean, certainly Simon Forman comes to mind, who was both a physician and an astrologer, but even people like Cardano and even Kepler, for instance, who wrote on astrological topics and also cast horoscopes. So I think Belle is very much in that mode. And I think one of the wonderful things about this book is that it really gives you a very close look at how this Renaissance astrologer did his work. And Charles has gone over the topics that he covered in his notebooks. So I won't really get into that, but I loved the detail that she gave us in sharing these notebooks with us and making them really accessible. Even though, I think as far as manuscript writing goes, his was not terrible. So, Charles can speak more on that, but but still, if you're not used to reading that kind of script, it's very nice to have the transcriptions and the translations as well. So I was very struck by the incredible amount of detail she put in, and I was also struck by the avenues that I think this book opens up, even for other studies of various facets of his work. For instance, I have a particular interest in astrological lots, and I was very struck by the amount of lots that Belle used, put in his delineations for various people that he had done individual charts for. And that made me, want to look more at that. So I'm sure that other people would look at other facets of what was covered in the book and see areas for further research. So it's not only a wonderful repository of techniques and the way a medieval astrologer was writing in this time frame, but it's also a window into further exploration, and I just think it's really important that this book came out. And I will end just by saying that a huge thank you to Luis and to Charles for finishing it and getting it published, because it's a wonderful record of Elena's work.
No, it was finished. It was already with the printers.
I understand. But you two took on the task of going through the last set of proofs,
yes,
writing the index,
yes,
making sure that everything was organized, and that that was really essential, I think. I mean, I suppose it could have been published as it was, but you both gave it that extra bit of care.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it was at least Elena saw the title page before she died.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so she was assured that the book would be published very soon.
And the illustrations, I'll just point out. I mean, I thought they're wonderful. I'm so pleased that Brill saw fit to publish them in color.
All in color.
That's absolutely fantastic to see those in the book.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, this was a trajectory that started long ago in the early 2000s when Elena and I stumbled on this manuscript. I don't recall if she tells this particular story in the book itself, but there was a very short reference in the footnote in a text of one of Portugal's historians of science, early historians of science, Luís Albuquerque, and he had a very, very brief mention of this manuscript, which was in the archive. He didn't give it too much importance, as he usually wouldn't, of astrological topics, and was a bit dismissive about it. But he did say that there were horoscopes in the manuscript, and this is something that it's not common in manuscripts here in Portugal, especially such early manuscript. So we went and and at the time we only saw the microfilm, and it was an ephemeris, so we had pages and pages and pages of ephemeris, which were interesting enough, but it's just numbers. And then suddenly, when we get to the very end, this entire collection of charts pops up. And I remember we were very happy to find it, and we were thinking, how can someone be so dismissive with this amount of charts? And it was quite large. At the time, we hadn't started, neither of us had started our academic studies, so we had no idea of how important that collection was, but we did arrange to have a copy of it done, and we had it for some years. So when Elena decided to proceed to the Warburg as a PhD, at the time, this manuscript was, let's say, one of her objectives, although not just the first one. She wanted to understand how was that in Portugal, being mainly French manuscript, how was that coming into the Portuguese archive. So she thought there might be some connections with France, Burgundy, and Portugal through the court, which were at that period, that might explain why this manuscript was here. But later on, the manuscript took a life of its own. And then, thanks to David Just, the second manuscript of Belle was found. Suddenly that was the centerpiece of the whole work. And as you were saying, Dorian, I think one of the most important things is that it shows how they were working. And we have technical examples. I think the lots is a huge contribution. It's very rare that we see manuscripts with this extensive application of lots to all kinds of charts, not only nativities, but also ingresses, revolutions. So some of the weird parts that sometimes we think, well, they wouldn't use this, he uses them, like the part of wool and the part of barley, stuff like that, which is strange and awkward. But he makes a use out of it and explains and interprets them, which is quite interesting. But also, as Charles was saying, we have a peek into his personal life, where we have the charts, not only the charts of his patrons, of the politicians and important figures of his time, but also of his family. And another aspect that shows up throughout the manuscript is the calculations of longevity, which he attempts several times for his children, and sometimes quite desperately trying to find the hope that the child will live longer, and then we finding out that the child died a few weeks or months afterward, after he made the calculations. He says that himself. So it's also a personal drama of an astrologer, which is a very rare facet to find in this kind of work. So I think these are major contributions that this work lays out, and I hope people can pick up on this and take it further, and that it will serve as a model, as an example of what you can do, and the amount of information that you can extract from these from this type of source.
Yeah, and I know Charles alluded to this also, but Elena's, how shall I put it, encyclopedic knowledge of medieval astrology, and as Charles said, gave her an advantage in understanding the way Belle was interpreting all of these various doctrines within the charts that he was looking at, and so that to me is a huge advantage of this book, because she speaks so authoritatively, and she understands the doctrines so well that it's it's not easy, but she makes it seem easy and obvious.
This is something I would like to pick up on, because it's an impact of the career of Elena that can be discerned already. I mean, I think it's still too early to judge what will be the impact of the book, although the potential is there, but the book is so recent. But there are quite a number of things that we can already say, especially if we consider the situation in Portugal, where it was her, her place. And the main thing was that for the first time, a scholar appeared who made the study of astrology credible. The scholarship, I mean, there was in academia, among historians and historians of culture, whatever, although people recognize the importance of astrology, there was much, patronizing going on. And one of the reasons was because people did not know top-level students of the discipline. So the discipline was suffering. I mean, I'm referring to the situation in Portugal. Huh? The discipline was suffering from the lack of, scholarly credibility. And this is something that was solved by Elena just by showing up. And she is, and I think I can say this with some authority, I think she is the first top-level scholar, expert on astrology in Portugal. And from, in a matter of some years, it was clear, because the milieu is very small, it was clear that it was possible to operate at the highest academic level while studying astrology. And the person who showed this was Elena. So this was a very important impact from her very, very brief career, was already this. And the second one, I mean, this was already alluded by Charles, was that she showed how astrology was made from the real inside, the real nuts and bolts of the thing. And I had many times complained with her that until this was made, it would be very difficult to advance, because many studies of astrology assumed a certain superiority towards the field, in the sense that I am a very good scholar of astrology, but I don't want to dirty my hands in the real nitty-gritty details. And there was a lot of patronizing in this position. And I said, this has to be changed, because otherwise it will not evolve. And I think her book is a major contribution in this direction, as you, both of you have already noted. Then now you realize what happens when a person fully cognizant of the techniques, the traditions, the mindset of a practicing astrologer. What happens when this scholar attacks and studies a document of the past? And so I don't claim that she was unique in this endeavor. Other people have already made the same, but her book is a major contribution in this field. In Portugal, definitely the first person to show that astrology could be studied with the highest levels of academic expertise, and since we are here, I think that the second one is Luis. Yeah.
Thank
For
you.
sure.
Thank you. But definitely, I agree with you. She was the first historian, Portuguese historian of astrology. The first one to complete her academic path, and then to publish, significantly on that areas. Yeah. So certainly the first. We don't have anyone else that came first that has written what she wrote in astrology, definitely. And I'll gladly follow her footsteps in that regard.
Yeah, and I can't think of any historian of astrology writing in the period that she's working in who can speak so authoritatively about techniques and practice. She is the voice of experience here. So, and the other thing that, as I was reading through the book, I realized, and I suppose I knew this intellectually, but as I was looking through the work and seeing how many techniques he was using and the rigor which he was applying to those, and I think maybe it was Henrique or Charles or both who mentioned made the comparison with doctors keeping case books and notebooks, that he was doing that as well. And what struck me was his complete confidence in the discipline that he was working in. There was no, this could be kind of quasi weird or anything like that. It was like, I'm the astrologer, I'm using all these techniques, and I'm making these predictions and interpretations. And it made me begin to think that this is probably how it was being observed within the wider culture, at least in France at that time. That people wouldn't, at this level, people would go to an astrologer the way they went to a doctor. And for perfectly legitimate reasons. And I guess that I had never been struck by that so forcefully until I looked at this book in more depth.
Yeah, I think that's good. I understand what you mean. It's again, it's rare that we have such this kind of testimony.
Yeah.
We have later we do, for the early modern period, we do have more information, but not such early. And as far as we know, this is the earliest collection of charts surviving of this size.
Mm-hmm.
This size, this is the earliest known collection of charts.
Yeah, I think.
Which is a genre that later on.
I mean, so much scholarship tends to, and I realize I'm generalizing here, tends to focus on the people, the anti-astrologers, if you will, that are always going to accompany the cultural history, right? But there's very little, if any, of that in here. So you can see the pure study of it without any of the extraneous astrology bashing that, of course, was going on in the culture, but it's really absent here, which is kind of refreshing, and it allows you to look at the discipline in its own terms, which I think is also very important.
Yeah, because most of the time, and I can speak that about my work, we have to handle the voices against and how that is shaping and putting into perspective what astrologers are doing. And here, there is absolutely no hint of that. Of course, as you said, it's going on in the culture. We know that exists at this period, but it's not on the source at all. That's not the point of concern.
Right. You never see him say, and I have to say this because somebody else will attack me for it. I mean, maybe some of it is implicit in the way he frames his judgment. But it's not overt one bit. Yeah.
But if he was writing these notebooks for himself, he didn't need convincing.
Well, of course. Yes, but I mean, that was very refreshing in a way, because you know, in a lot of the scholarship, people feel compelled to bring it up.
Yeah, the history of astrology was mostly the history of the polemic.
Yes,
not
precisely.
This is all over now.
Yeah. So that was another thing that struck me about this, and another reason why I think it's such an important breakthrough book in that sense.
I think if I had to summarize Elena, it always comes to my mind a saying that I once heard and never forgot, but I cannot pinpoint who said it, but it has a complete parallel with Elena. So this was someone who said, I love the study of history because I love people, and because I love life, and because I love people. And I think this summarizes Elena. We could really understand that her interest for historical topics, and mostly history of astrology, was intimately connected with this, love, this joy for people that Dorian, you mentioned, and this was so characteristic of her. So it was a common passion. I mean, whether they were living 500 or 600 years ago or today, it was like the same passion that she would put with her friends, her colleagues, and then she would put with her historical characters. So I think this is how I remember Helena. Yeah.
But you should also mention that part of her love was for animals as well.
Oh, absolutely.
And she really loved animals. And I remember her mentioning that when she was little, she was brought up by her grandfather's stories of Greek mythology. Yes. Yeah. And I think this idea of Greek mythology, I mean, the planets, after all, are named after the Greek gods and so on. Yeah. That also is an inspiration, has been an inspiration for her.
Yeah, that was where everything started, with those histories of mythology that her grandfather used to tell her. And that later evolved into her studying astrology, which she searched for a number of years, and then found the traditional branch, which she knew.
So the gods are still present in the study of astrology, in the understanding.
You could say that, yes. Yeah, and she had she always knew she wanted to do something on astrology. When she started her historical studies, it wasn't in her mind to continue and to have an academic career. That was not the point at the time. She really wanted to study, and she selected history as a topic she would like, and she would like to pursue. And then when came the time to continue towards an MA study, she faced for the first time the barrier that exists, of starting a study on astrology, and this is told by her former supervisor for the MA. And at the time when she went there and she told, I want to do something about astrology, she was very doubtful if she could do that, because it was not a topic she was familiar with. It was not her area at all. She asked her, well, but do we have sources for that? So when Elena returned later to have the second meeting where she would present a plan for her MA, she brought almost the entire scheme, of the of what would be her MA there with the sources, where to find them, supporting bibliography, etc. And she said, "Okay, I'm convinced. I'm completely convinced. Let's do it." So she was a pioneer in that as well. I think hers is the first MA in Portugal to address the topic of astrology, without being, the Inquisition or witches or sorcery, not that kind of more cultural way, but astrology as it was practiced in Portugal, with the source that rarely is taken, even outside Portugal, which is the Chronicles. I think that was quite innovative. Look at the Chronicles, see how is astrology playing out a part there in the narrative of a king, for the bad or for the better of it. And she did, and she was very proud to do that. And I think also an innovation at that time was she wrote it in English immediately, which was not common at her time. So she was one of the first to write it in English in that department specifically. And that opened the door.
Absolutely, yes. I wouldn't have accepted her as a PhD student if I hadn't read her MA dissertation.
Yes, that was an excellent choice for her, because that opened up immediately to a wider international audience, because English is a language that almost everyone can read, while Portuguese, unfortunately, it's quite limited. Long time ago now.
So what is the legacy, and what is going to, obviously her work continues.
Her book continues. One of the things that Dorian was talking about, her expertise, that you cannot see, a part of this that you cannot see in the book, and this book at least, was the huge glossary that she built for the PhD. There was a whole second volume with a complete glossary of the techniques discussed in the book, which at the time she decided to publish independently. And we worked on that, we still worked on that, a few chapters on that, and now I'm putting all of that together so that can be almost an independent book by itself. And that's a glossary that she practically built out of her head. She just wrote it out of her head and then, verified it and consolidated with sources as necessary. And that I hope to be published in the future, and that will also show her knowledge.
And that will be a wonderful continuation of the tradition of people writing glossaries. There's one, oh gosh, can I remember the name of the author? It's in French. It's French for Roman astrology. And Bezza, I think, Giuseppe Bezza has also written astrological glossaries in Italian. So this would be a wonderful addition to that. And again, comes with this exceedingly well-sourced place of deep knowledge of the techniques.
Yeah, that's quite advanced, and I hope to next year to have that quite advanced. Another of her legacies is, of course, the Astra project, which she was the head of the whole process, because she had a very she dealt with people very easily, so she could network very well.
Yes.
Perhaps astrology will have a more important place in the University of Lisbon in the teaching of culture and civilization.
Well, there is, well, at least at the department. I mean, Helena, when she was even in England, she was in constant contact, and so it was always clear that she would return because she wanted to do something here institutionally, and we had, of course, grandiose plans for that too. But her lineage is very, very visible. I mean, first, immediately with Louise, of course, and now with Elena and Louise's younger acquaintances, colleagues, and students that they're bringing, and so a few of them are very good, and so there is a descendancy of that. It comes from Elena originally, and then Elena and Louise, and then a group of people. So I'm pretty sure, and this is some plan that I'm pretty sure that Louise will materialize this, a major study of the astrological sources in Portugal. This he will, an archival work with interpretation of what's there, because there are lots of materials, as you know very well, which are merely described as astrological in archives, and of course this is ridiculous. You need to look more carefully. So I think this will be a second phase, which will be the archival material in the next years will be radically clarified. We will know much more, and perhaps some surprises will show up. But even if not, just having a good overview of what's there, with good descriptions, etc. I think this is something that will be very important. But then other things,
that's one for the future. That's quite an important work to do, and she was very keen on doing that. There was a whole project in place, and there is a whole project in place to do that. Hopefully soon. There's this book. She still has a paper to come out that should come out soon, probably sometime this month, in the IKGF magazine of the Journal of Prognostication. That should come soon. That would be her last paper that Dorian and I reviewed and make the final adjustments.
Well, there is a paper she wanted to write with me, remember?
There's a paper that she wanted to write.
She was always distributing work.
So there's still that one.
First draft, and then we discussed this paper, and it was a pity. Of course, we would do it, but now I don't know.
No, not. We'll see if we can do that one. There's a lot written already, and we'll see in the future. Now that the Astra project will go on in the form of the podcast, of course, because it's our window to the general public, and I hope to have the big meeting that we were planning for May of 2019 to be held next year, if all goes well and travel becomes easier. We'll see. Still a bit soon to know.
Yeah, but the work that she and you have inaugurated with the Astra project, and with really wanting to nail down the history of techniques and practices, and I just think it's so important. There's so much, how shall we say, dodgy information out there.
Exactly.
That it's really, really important to have clear and accurate lines of transmission of doctrines and techniques. Absolutely, so she's given us all the boost.
Exactly. She created this entire project, this entire line of research. She put this in motion with all her energy, and now it's up to us to move it along its path and perhaps consolidate. And I've discussed this with every one of you at one point, and not consolidate the history of astrology as a field of research within general history, with its own materials, its own approaches, and I think that's was one of her goals, certainly. Yeah. Okay. Well, I thank you very much for being here and to help me with this episode. As I said, it wouldn't be easy for me to do this by myself, and it'll stay here as a testimony to her work. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis.
Thank you, Luis.
Thank you.